The Improved Emperor's Guide to Tamriel. This is a rather special review as this is absolutely one of my favorite books of all time. And I say that as someone who, while I absolutely love the Elder Scrolls games, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a particularly hardcore fan. I've only played Oblivion, Skyrim, and the Elder Scrolls Online. In fact, I doubt the Elder Scrolls would even make it into my top 10 favorite fantasy universes. But I'm definitely a big fan of the books that have been produced around this franchise, and this book is the pinnacle of that. It feels like they've taken a checklist of what I think would make the coolest, best book imaginable and made it real. But all of this is quite high praise, so I want to try and justify it as best I can. Usually in reviews I'm very worried about overselling a book, but in this case I really don't think that's possible. If anything, I'm worried I'm not going to fully impress upon you all the reasons this book is just so amazing. So what is it? Well, it came as part of the collector's edition for the Elder Scrolls Online. I think it was called the Imperial Edition. That's actually the only thing I kind of don't like about the book, is that it was part of a collector's edition, but we'll talk more about that later. And if you're familiar with the Elder Scrolls library or the Tales of Tamriel books, if you're not, I have done reviews on those, and watching those might be helpful to for a point of reference for a lot of things I'm going to talk about in this review. But if you know those books, you kind of know the gist of what Elder Scrolls lore books tend to be like. They're treated like books that have actually come from the Elder Scrolls universe. You know, this book is written by someone in Tamriel, so all the fiction of the Elder Scrolls is treated as non-fiction. I mentioned in the reviews for the Skyrim library and Tales of Tamriel that those weren't really lore books in the strictest sense. They really weren't focused on imparting a lot of information about the world. It was a lot more about sort of like entertainment, whereas this book, while equally entertaining, is more focused on imparting more informative aspects of the lore, the history, the cultures, you know, solid information about the world and its people. In fact, the idea behind this book actually has earlier origins in two books called The Pocket Guide to the Empire, the first edition of which came out with Redguard, and it was really just like kind of like a crappy stapled booklet, really bad black and white art, but it established a lot of things that we see end up in this book. That is a book that's a guide to Tamriel's history, geography, anthropology, but doing so in a really fun way, where a citizen of Tamriel has, you know, crossed out words and written little notes in the margins, and that's something we see in this book that's really great too. So then the Pocket Guide to the Empire actually got a second edition. It was sort of beefed up and made a little bit more impressive, and came out with the collector's edition for Oblivion. I'll actually do a review on that book in a few weeks, because that might be fun to look at. And so when the Elder Scrolls Online came out, they released this book, but it just like completely blows those out of the water. So the sort of story behind the book is that there is a book called The Emperor's Guide to Tamriel, but it was written a long time ago and has since become very out of date. And so Chancellor Abner Tharn, who you will know from your ESO adventures, has commissioned this guy who's sort of a writer and artist to update the book. And so what we have here is sort of his working draft, his journal, where he has sort of taken pages from the original Emperor's Guide, which, by the way, doesn't actually exist in our world. But he's taken pages from this book and sort of pasted them throughout this journal, and then through his travels throughout Tamriel has, you know, crossed things out and writing notes in the margins and things he's observed to sort of correct and add to the original Emperor's Guide. And so on any given page you will have something that looks like, you'll have a section that looks like it was torn out of a pre-existing book, and that gives you more of the sort of like hard-hitting scholarly information. And then next to that you will have the handwritten notes from our author. And this is one of the reasons I think this is just such an amazing lore book, because most tend to fall into either information and tend to be boring and dry, or entertainment and tend to be rather light on facts and info. But this book brings both of those ideas together in the best possible way, like it's some sort of old-fashioned age of exploration traveler's diary. And so you're not just left reading kind of boring historical text. So, you know, you might have the text talking about the Argonians in a very general and sort of cultural sense, but then you'll also have the more sort of story travel aspect of the author's writings, where he's actually, engaging with a specific Argonian. It's not just like a faceless mass you're reading about. You then get to sort of engage on a character and personal level and story, things that are going to keep you engaged and give you a context for the information you're learning. And it's so substantial and covers such a wide variety of stuff, because usually with like the sort of books that come with collector's editions, usually like art books or whatever, typically you're lucky if they're like 80 pages. Some of the better ones, like the Skyrim art book or the Witcher 3 art book, are probably closer to like 120 to 160 pages, whereas this book is over 220 pages. And that just makes it feel deep and rich and endless, like the Elder Scrolls games themselves try to be. Additionally, he's supposedly an artist, which is the justification for all the imagery that you'll see throughout. And not just any artwork, amazing fantasy art. In my opinion, much better than Skyrim, Witcher, Dragon Age. I mean, honestly, it doesn't even really look like concept art in the traditional sense. It looks like final, polished, like promotional artwork. Like it's been deliberately created as like a wallpaper or like some sort of art for a trading card game. Which is why with this Skyrim library and Tales of Tamriel, I said, even though those used a lot of really great art, I wasn't sure if they were necessarily worth getting just for the art, because there wasn't really enough. This book, however, definitely pay close attention, because I think this, for some people, very well could be worth it just for the art alone. And it's also just kind of crazy that this book that has so much text is still able to provide just as much, if not more, art than a typical art book. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing just a standard art book, but I always really appreciate it when developers, publishers, companies, whoever, go the extra mile and recycle that concept art to actually have some sort of new function, i.e. as illustrations in a lore book. Maybe the greatest challenge of any sort of visual coffee table book is the idea of balancing text and images, because if you've got a lot of text, then you're probably not going to have a lot of images, or at least not a lot of big images, and then you lose detail. But if they're too big and you've got a lot of images, then there's not as much text and it's not as engaging, and it's this sort of whole balancing act that's almost impossible to get right. But this book does it just better than almost any other book I've ever seen. The way they have included so much art and visuals at an appropriate size alongside just so much text as well, it really is remarkable. You look at these pages and there is not an inch of blank space, even if that space is just being filled up with a tiny little black and white sketch or some sort of like ink stain or a little handwritten note. Every turn of the page there's just so much wonderful stuff to take in. And I mean, even beyond the idea of layout, obviously, the graphic design in this book is immaculate and just has so much care and effort and intelligence behind it. And there's actually no credits anywhere throughout the book, which on the one hand is kind of a shame, because I wish I knew the people who were involved in the making of this book. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of glad it's a mystery, just so that I can continue to believe that this book is surely a gift from the Aedra themselves. Also, I know I said I was going to speak about the collector's edition this book came as part of, but this video is already going to be running too long, so I'm actually going to save that and a couple of other things I wanted to say for a later review, because lucky us, there's actually kind of a, I guess you could call it the second in this series of books, which came out as part of the ESO Morrowind collector's edition. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for that review as well.